It was May 1918 that a new friend and companion came into my life, a character, a personality, and a ringtail wonder. He weighed less than 1 pound when I discovered him, a furry ball of utter dependence and awakening curiosity, unweaned and defenseless. Wowzer and I were immediately protective. We would have fought any boy or dog in town who sought to harm him.
And so begins the delightful and vivid memoir of a different era, written by the author, literary critic, and editor Sterling North. The most personal and deeply felt of his 30 books, he called it RASCAL. Sterling North was in his mid-50s when he sat down at his well-used Royal typewriter to begin the story of a remarkable year in his life, 44 years past. The experiences and emotions he was about to commit to paper had stayed with him all his life, in great part defining his personality and his beliefs. He now lived comfortably in a large house outside Morristown, New Jersey, surrounded by 27 acres of nature. With him was Gladys Buchanan North, his beloved wife and workmate of 35 years. He was an avid and knowledgeable naturalist, and a man who loved fishing almost as much as he felt compelled to write. The house and property, with its pond and streams and wildlife, were the reward of many years of untiringly constant work in literature. His father had just died at the age of 99. Sterling had been working on a series of historical biographies, and now the time had come for him to look back upon his own life. What was to become RASCAL, the multi-million-selling and widely translated book, began quite simply and naturally with a precociously curious boy in a southern Wisconsin town. The first decade of the 20th century was a time of transition in southern Wisconsin, as Old World traditions gave way to New World technologies and attitudes. It was here, in November of 1906, that Sterling North was born in a farmhouse on the shores of Lake Koshkonong, the youngest of 2 boys and 2 girls. He had the good fortune to come into the world surrounded by people who loved books and knowledge. His father, David Willard North, was widely educated and traded in real estate across the upper Midwest. His mother, Elizabeth Nelson North, was a talented linguist, biologist, and history teacher. There was enough remaining of the area's natural heritage that young Sterling and his parents could walk through the woods near their home and treat themselves to a cornucopia of nature's wonders. Elizabeth presented to her son the world of botany. David Willard knew all the birds in southern Wisconsin, taught as a boy by the renowned naturalist Ture Comline. The 4 North children, Theo, Jessica, Herschel, and Sterling, began reading when they were quite young. Sterling showed a remarkable ability to memorize poetry. He would have noticed his brother and sisters writing their own poems, and soon he was to give it a try. By then, his brother and sisters were in their teens. They had won top prizes from St. Nicholas Magazine, a nationwide journal for children. Of course, young Sterling wanted his first poem to be published too, and to see the pride in his mother's eyes. Libby North was 40 when Sterling was born, and it was hard work for her to raise 4 children and keep a household in order. In the spring of 1914, she became ill. One day, 7-year-old Sterling went outside and was smelling a hyacinth. An aunt came out of the house, told him his mother was dead, and simply walked back inside. It was less than a year later that his first poem was published in St. Nicholas Magazine. As a grown man, Sterling North would be almost physically returned to that terrible day, simply by the odor of hyacinth. But his extraordinary gift of memory would serve him well as an author and reviewer, though its most vivid effects came when he wrote or read poetry.
Poetry, of course, is emotion viewed in retrospect and in moments of repose, as somebody has said much better than I have. And I think it's moments of emotion which come back. That is, it's remembered against the impulse that you had at the time.
The North family had moved to Edgerton in 1909 when Sterling was 3. Many years later, he remembered the sound of horse hooves on the dusty road as the family rode up to their new home, and his mother crying for joy when she saw their indoor bathroom. Here was a town full of life, with merchants and matrons, clergymen and laborers. It had been settled mostly by Scandinavian, German, and British immigrants. Many of them were tobacco growers and traders. And there was the annual Irish picnic at the fairgrounds, the social event of the year, and an occasion for a bit of friendly wagering. As Sterling grew up here, he developed a keen awareness not just of the natural world, but also of human beings and their habits. In 1934, when he was 27 years old, his book Plowing on Sunday would be published, a romantic yet frank and earthy novel set in a somewhat fictional version of Edgerton he called Brailsford Junction. Here he writes about a teenaged boy on the eve of World War I.
To Peter Brailsford, impatient with his youth, torn with fear of God, of hell, and of sex, romantic, inexperienced, wistful, anxious to get ahead in the world, yet essentially unworldly, intolerant, rebellious, headstrong, filled with hatreds, jealousies, and a morbid interest in death, saddled with concepts of duty, patriotism, and courage which were fatal to millions of his generation.
Many of the characters in this book are only slightly disguised as fictional. Plowing on Sunday was well received by reviewers and the public, and it featured a jacket illustration by an up-and-coming artist named Grant Wood. But in Edgerton, it set off volleys of outrage, and perhaps some laughter behind closed doors. It was some years before a copy of the book could be found in the town's library.
My dad had tremendous energy. He was always working on one project or another. He loved to write, and if he weren't actually writing a book, he'd be writing endless letters. He seemed to have a tremendous need to write.
At the time Sterling began writing RASCAL, he was in the midst of supervising a 40-volume series of historical biographies for young readers called the North Star Books. While he was editing the work of many other writers, Sterling himself was coming out with one book per year. He would completely immerse himself in the subject of each book, setting free his fascination with the ways of human endeavors. The years of 1955 to 1964 were incredibly productive. He wrote biographies of Abraham Lincoln, the young Thomas Edison, Henry David Thoreau, George Washington, and Mark Twain. And then there was his autobiographical book, RASCAL. Sterling was 11 years old when he and a friend and his St. Bernard Wowzer came across a den of raccoons while exploring some woods. All but one of the babies were carried off by their wildly protective mother. The tiny critter who remained was headed for a new home in town. The year was 1918. Jessica was now a poet and a graduate student in Chicago. Theo was married and living in Minnesota. And Herschel was in Europe, fighting on the front lines of the war that was to end all wars. And while David Willard North was a kind and intelligent man, he didn't seem to be fully aware that his son was, in fact, still young.
If I came home long after dark, my father would merely look up from his book to greet me vaguely and courteously. He allowed me to live my own life. He even let me build my 18-foot canoe in the living room.
And my grandpa would go off for a week's trip, for instance, to one of the Dakotas where he was buying mineral interests or maybe buying second and third mortgages or whatever he happened to be doing at the moment. And he would leave my dad here alone. And I think that my dad became very mature and very responsible at an early age because he had to.
Sterling grew to become a dedicated father and husband. Gladys was the steadying influence for a man of strong emotions and deeply felt beliefs. A constant and astute reader herself, she served as his in-house editor. After hours of intense work, Sterling would rush forth from his study with a new chapter or book review or a magazine essay and read it aloud to members of his family. Gladys knew to wait until the intensity of creation had cooled a bit before she might offer a few words of welcomed advice. Of course, she knew very well the tales of Sterling as a boy with his pet raccoon. She even put a little ceramic raccoon next to his typewriter, just as a reminder.
When we were little, we were lucky enough to have bedtime stories from my parents, and both of them often told us about their childhoods. And my very favorite was the one about the raccoon, Rascal, and washing a sugar cube.
One morning, young Sterling decided that Rascal was entitled to eat at the breakfast table. He brought his old high chair down from the attic and treated Rascal to a bowl of milk and a lump of sugar. And Rascal did what is instinct to every raccoon. He washed his meal before eating it.
In a few moments, of course, it melted entirely away. He felt all over the bottom of the bowl to see if it dropped it. Finally, he looked at me and trilled a shrill question: who had stolen his sugar lump?
Rascal learned from his experiences, too. That was the last sugar lump he would try to wash. In fact, he soon learned where the treats were kept and began helping himself. Just as young Sterling was coming to know the world of nature, young Rascal began to explore the world of humans. Both were extremely curious and headstrong creatures, determined to find out what life was all about. The urge to explore and to stretch boundaries became a recurring theme in Sterling North's work. Oftentimes, he wrote about lives in transition, such as children approaching adulthood, or about how modest beginnings could lead to great achievements. When Sterling started high school, his plans were fairly straightforward. He would become a book-reading prize fighter, presumably after starring as quarterback for the Edgerton High School football team. All at once, though, his ambitions suffered a devastating blow. At the age of 15, he was stricken with polio and was partially paralyzed. He was told he would likely never walk again, but that news simply stoked the fire of his resolve. While convalescing at his sister Theo's new home on Lake Winnebago, he would swim across the bay in the background of this photo with a metal brace attached to his right leg. All the while, he was thinking about a girl his age he had met just 2 months before polio came to challenge his life. While he never played football, he did graduate at the top of his class. He was able to walk again, but he knew that was not his most precious ability.
The great dawning realization was that I had a mind which could soar over far greater obstacles than could my body, even at its best.
There were 3 things he knew for certain: that he would make his career as a writer, that someday he would marry Gladys Buchanan, and that there was a big world out there to get to know, and he was going to start with Chicago. Chicago was a rip-roaring, prosperous, and swaggering city, known by the poet Carl Sandburg as the City of Big Shoulders. A young man fresh from Wisconsin might have been made to pause at this place, but Sterling quickly found his stride at the University of Chicago. As a freshman, the first short story he wrote was published in the literary magazine The Dial. It wasn't long before his poetry earned him national collegiate prizes, while many of his poems were published in major national magazines. Sterling never paused in his wooing of his first and final love. In June of 1927, Gladys Buchanan and Sterling North were married. And on February 26, 1929, their first child, David, was born. That very same day, Sterling North's first book, The Pedro Guarino, was published in the United States, England, and Germany. Working on it was an extraordinary experience for the 22-year-old Sterling. He collaborated on the book with Harry Dean, an Islamic Moroccan sea captain by way of Philadelphia, and an ardent African nationalist.
He cut quite a figure in his old sea captain's coat, with its shining brass buttons and its carefully mended elbows, his leonine head uncovered to the March wind. "Pardon me, young man," he said, "but do you agree with Plato that philosophers should rule the world?"
Sterling and Gladys were poor, but Harry Dean was destitute at the time. The young couple would invite Harry to their small apartment, where Gladys would fix meals, while Sterling interviewed the captain day after day, week after week. Reviews of the book were enthusiastic, while sales were middling. Even so, Gladys and Sterling signed over their royalties to the captain. Though Elizabeth North could hardly have expected the trajectory of her son's life, Sterling would no doubt have found pride in his mother's eyes. 1929 was notable for another event. In October, the American economy collapsed. Sterling's obvious talent got him a job, but it was his hard work that kept it for him after the crash. He began as a cub reporter at the Chicago Daily News, writing about any subject towards which his editor pointed him.
I worked in constant fear of the quiet city editor. I covered every sort of assignment, from gang slayings to golden weddings, and from night police to getting cats out of trees and dogs out of manholes.
Carl Sandburg also wrote for the Daily News, and he often bought Sterling lunch. He casually pumped him for information about the characters he'd met while working on his stories. They became friends, both believing that the history of the country was told in the lives of individual people, be they great or hardly known. Soon, the paper was publishing feature articles under Sterling's byline, as he reveled in the people and rhythms of the city. And in 1932, when he was just 25 years old, Sterling was named the literary editor of the Daily News, the youngest in the paper's long and illustrious history. This was a time when authors were famous, and the occasions of their new books were of popular interest. Sterling now began an extraordinary routine. He would read and review as many as 5 books each week, as well as edit the work of other reviewers for the newspaper. He would keep to this same weekly schedule as literary editor for nearly 25 years, at the Chicago Daily News until 1943, then at the New York Post, followed by the New York World Telegram and Sun. 1956 was the first year of what he called his retirement, when he began working on the North Star books for the publisher Houghton Mifflin. And that is only the lesser-known half of Sterling North's life. What he produced at home became his legacy. A second child was born in 1932, a daughter whom Gladys and Sterling named Ariel. And so he began a series of books for children. There was 5 Little Bears in 1935, the Zipper ABC book 2 years later, and in 1940, Greased Lightning. And then there were the books he wrote for adults. During the 1930s alone, there was Plowing on Sunday and 4 more novels. In 7 Against the Years, he creates an autobiographical character amongst a masterfully observed menagerie of Chicagoans, made from the sparkling, vulnerable, self-absorbed, and questing people he encountered during his early years in the city. Sterling and Gladys managed to scrape together enough to buy a small farm property in Michigan. The family spent as much time there as they could. where the large vegetable garden was a great help during the Depression years.
And I think that it helped my dad tremendously. He was so ambitious and worked so hard at his job. And he was always writing evenings and weekends besides when we were home. And to get away for a little bit and to be out in the country, it renewed his spirit. He loved to be out in the woods. He loved to be fishing. He loved to do so many things with us as a family. Many hikes and boat trips. And every time we'd go out, he would teach us things about flowers, about trees, about birds.
A long Wisconsin winter had passed, and Sterling was now 12. His friend RASCAL was growing to adulthood much faster than the boy, though, and the raccoon's hungry instincts were pointing him towards the neighbors' gardens and chicken coops. So Sterling would take his pal out of town on trips to the boy's favorite fishing spots. RASCAL would splash and sniff and patter about while learning what it is to be a raccoon in nature. But back at home, Sterling was about to learn more about adult humans and their attitudes about boys and their ring-tailed wonders. A raccoon can't help but believe that hen's eggs and corn on the cob are put on Earth to be tasty raccoon treats. Of course, that meant to many of the North's neighbors that any raccoon was a pest, whether he was called RASCAL or not. A meeting was called at the North House, where Sterling's father, who was a justice of the peace, mediated a compromise. Sterling would build a cage for RASCAL, and anywhere around town they went, the boy would lead his friend on a leash. Sterling would reluctantly build the cage, with characteristic ingenuity, but the carefree days enjoyed together by boy and raccoon were drawing to a close.
He was just incredibly dedicated, hour after hour after hour at the typewriter, and rewriting, listening to everything he wrote. He had this marvelous ear.
Sterling had talked for years of retiring from the constant deadlines of the newspaper business. He would devote himself to fishing, music, companionship, and writing his own books. At the age of 50, though, this decision became necessary when health problems forced their way to the front of his life.
30 years in Chicago and New York is enough for any man, and 25 years of a daily deadline was more than enough. It was time for Gladys and me to enjoy our Walden. Perhaps, as Thoreau once said, we had several more lives to live.
As he directed his energies into the North Star books, he found time to welcome nature with its gentler sets of rhythms back into his life. He could take time to contemplate his own history and the memories that were most important to him.
And just so many details from his childhood. I think this is one of the things that makes RASCAL so touching, because he remembers not only what happened, but he remembers it with an intensity, particularly anything that was the least bit emotional. So whenever I read that book, I still laugh and cry because he brings everything to life with such intensity.
RASCAL quickly became Sterling North's most popular book. The story of a boy and his raccoon friend was translated into dozens of languages, and following his novel So Dear to My Heart, it was the second of his books to be made by Disney into a movie. His next book was Hurry, Spring. This was to be the first of a series on the magnificent and mysterious workings of nature throughout the seasons. But a series of strokes interrupted his writing. Once more, Sterling's overwhelming drive pushed him past the physical disabilities. It was to his history and his family he returned for his last book, The Wolfling. Published in 1969 to more awards and acclaim, Sterling wrote it while partially paralyzed, typing the entire manuscript with one finger. It's a novel about David Willard North's boyhood as a child of immigrants in Wisconsin. In it, Sterling celebrates his father in the natural world, but also the people who must inevitably try to conquer it. One warm and pleasant Saturday, young Sterling and Rascal ate breakfast together at the dining room table. They set off for a day of fishing and picnicking, but this Saturday was to be different. The boy who left the house that day had come to understand something greater than himself. As the day ended, Sterling and a creature of nature he'd come to love paddled towards Koshkonong Creek. Sterling gave his friend the final gift that he knew he must. Hearing the trill of a female raccoon, Rascal swam to the shore. With a last look towards Sterling, he disappeared into the woods. And so, a man who had come to know the thoughts of countless writers and historical figures throughout his career, released to the world the essence of his own life, told as the true story of a boy.
The impulse to write, I believe, is the desire to communicate a memory, a mood, a distillation of delight that might otherwise be lost forever. It is mortal man's feeble attempt to stay the hand of time.